Despite the fact that we've seen that competent writers of English do in fact use the passive voice, and in fact they can use it to be humorous, we still do find this advice out there that we should avoid passives. I put passives in scare quotes here because oftentimes, really, what people are saying, well, they don't really know what passive voice is, and the things that they're telling you to avoid aren't really passive. Sometimes it just seems to be like unclear or weak writing, is what they mean. So, um, but let's take some look at some of the examples and where people have problems with it. And we can see some places too where maybe the passive isn't the best choice. All right, so one problem that sometimes people bring up when they're objecting to the passive is that it allows you to omit who did what, right? You can say something like mistakes were made, and that way, oh, who made those mistakes? I'm not telling you. I'm not owning up to the fact that I made them or that I know who made them or whatever. Mistakes were made. Thing is, though, you can obfuscate with the active as well, right? You can say mistakes happened, that's an active clause, but you're also avoiding taking responsibility or assigning blame. Okay? Um, Conversely, people, especially within academic writing, you often find that people use a passive thinking that they're being more objective. As Williams and Cullum note, scholarly writers rarely use the first person to describe specific actions they performed as part of their research, instead, using a passive to name an action anyone could perform. Although it's common, they observe that this doesn't make the researchers' thinking more objective. We know that behind those impersonal sentences are still flesh and blood people doing thinking and writing. And this is usually reflected when they turn to things like I now consider, right? When they start talking about their writing and their thinking, as opposed to, we anesthetized the mice or something like that, where they say the mice were anesthetized. Okay, and we can end up with clunky passives. So just because just because I would defend passives and say we shouldn't reflexively get rid of them, we also shouldn't just blindly use them either. And there are places where you can end up with a passive that's very ineffectual. Of course, you can do the same with an active clause. There can be cases where the active would be the poorer choice. But, I do want to give you one example here where the passive is a bad example. So we have this is a sentences actually we've seen before. This is an abstract, and the abstract ends with this sentence, and I don't think there's a clunkier passive than I've ever encountered. So, a case against compulsory attendance policies, which is based on evaluation of the empirical research and the application of Pintrick's model to the question of the value of compulsory attendance policies in higher education, is presented. This sentence is a disaster. Um, your subject, again, ideally, or people tend to prefer subjects that are old familiar information. We have a huge long subject here. It's long, it's complicated, it's new information. Why did we use the passive? This makes no sense, right? So we've got this massive long sentence or subject. In clear writing, subjects will be short, sweet, and to the point. And if we turn this into an active, it reads so much better. This paper presents a case against compulsory attendance policies, which is based on evaluation of the empirical research and the application of Pintrick's model to the question of the value of compulsory attendance policies in higher education. Whoops, that last is presented shouldn't have been taken out, right? So that reads so much better. I mean, it's still, a mouthful and everything, but it definitely reads a lot better. So frequently we are told to avoid passives. Microsoft Word might mark them for you. Again, this is often misguided advice. So if somebody gives you this advice, if they have authority over you, you might have to listen to it and do whatever they say. But I would, if you can avoid that advice, take it with a grain of salt. Know that people are often giving this advice, don't really know what they're talking about. And we can see, some examples of this. So, for example, there's a very famous writing by George Orwell, Politics in the English Language, and so he gives one needs rules that one can rely on when instinct fails. I think the following rules will cover most cases, and amongst those rules, never use the passive, where you can use the active, but he can't follow his own advice even in his own essay. Does he know what a passive voice is? I don't know, because if you look at his essay, it's loaded with them. So, for example, this is the same essay where he says, never use the passive. And what does he say? Oh, a verb becomes a phrase made up of a noun or adjective tacked on to, that is tacked on to, so that's a bare passive, onto some general purpose verb. In addition, the passive voice is wherever possible used, in preference to the active, and noun constructions are used instead of gerunds. The range of verbs is further cut, and the banal statements are given an appearance. And prepositions are replaced by phrases, and oh my god, the ends of sentences are saved by anticlimax by such resounding commonplaces. I mean, at this point, you got to think the guy is like playing with you, right? Don't use passives, and I'm going to load my prose with them. And it's not just in this essay, this is the first page of his most famous novel, 1984. And again, we're never disappointed. There's a passive. The electric current was cut off during daylight hours, right there in the first sentence of the novel. Great stuff, or right the first page of the novel. This is another book that has been responsible for this bad advice, and all I can think really is this book really is written as some sort of joke because it it violates its own advice as soon as it says it on a number of things. So again here we're told to use the active voice, that it's more direct and vigorous. Again, we're given a kind of, well, we saw why these sentences aren't so good. I shall always remember my first visit to Boston. That is much better than my first visit to Boston will always be remembered by me. But we saw why that is, right? So we're taking our old information and we're making it part of the by phrase instead of keeping it as a subject. Not good stuff. But again, this book can't even avoid using the passive itself. So the need to make a particular word the subject of a sentence will often, as in these examples, determine which voice is to be used. This is true not only in narrative concerned principally with action, but in writing of any kind. Many a tame sentence of description or exposition can be made lively and emphatic, so by substituting a transitive in the active voice. So again, this book, which has been very influential, apparently has no idea what a active and passive is. And actually, to reemphasize this, it gives these example sentences on the left and says these are passives, and here you should rewrite them as actives over here. The only thing is, over here, this one could be heard. That's actually passive. At dawn, the crowing of a rooster could be heard. That one is in fact passive. The other examples over here aren't. There were a great number of dead leaves lying on the ground. There's no past participle anywhere in that clause. The reason he left college was that his health became impaired. Impaired, but that's now an adjective. It's got became in front of it. Seems impaired, very impaired. That's an adjective. It's no longer passive. It was not long before she was very sorry that she had said what she said. Nothing in there, no past participle, there's nothing in there. And these aren't really even fair side by side comparisons. There's, lots of extra words and things going on here that have been pared down here, and much different than being passive and active. So again, they honestly don't know what the hell they're talking about, and you shouldn't be listening to that kind of advice and people who espouse something similar. So often the admonition against passives is rolled into general advice to produce strong writing with vivid verbs, perhaps to avoid the verb be altogether. And again, this advice seems to go against what competent writers actually do. So a book I enjoy called Breaking the Rules by Edgar Schuster, he went through and looked at actually some of what Orwell and White and some other people did in their writing. And here's the verbs he found. So he went through and listed them: omit, assumed, is, share, follows, an awful lot of be, takes, remarked, is, have, were, is, knows, determined, rank, turns, leap, hug, is. And what did he find? Well, 40% of the time Orwell was using a be verb, 46% of the time E.B. White and Strunk and White, and Kingsolver 25% of the time. So how many of their verbs are vivid or strong? Hardly any. So he really recommends to just let your verbs, as he says, fall where they may. And again, we see some examples where be can be used to good effect. And again, this isn't even apart from being passive or not, just be by itself, right? So again, the regular, this is our life, the universe, and everything. The regular early morning yell of horror was the sound of Arthur Dent waking up and suddenly remembering where he was. It wasn't just that the cave was cold. It wasn't just that it was damp and smelly. It was that the cave was in the middle of Islington and there wasn't a bus due for 2 million years. Time is the worst place, so to speak, to get lost in, as Arthur Dent could testify. Okay, so we got lots of be verbs there, but it's very evocative, humorous, all sorts of good things going on. Or how about this? This is the opening to Peter Pan, and this is delightful. All children except one grow up. They soon know that they will grow up. And the way Wendy knew was, there's a be verb, was this. One day, when she was 2 years old, she was playing in a garden, and she plucked another flower and ran with it to her mother. I suppose she must have looked rather delightful, for Mrs. Darling put her hand to her heart and cried, "Oh, why can't you remain like this forever?" This was all that passed between them on the subject, but henceforth Wendy knew that she must grow up. You always know after you are two. Two is the beginning of the end. I mean, is that not a great passage? And it's hard to know how you'd make it better by replacing forms of be. So, again, um, you know, people really need to, have some faith